In the small, close-knit town of Meadow Ridge, 12-year-old Jack Palmer lives an ordinary life, quietly navigating school and helping his hard-working single mother, Sarah. But everything changes on a chilly autumn afternoon when Jack notices Frank, a homeless man sitting alone on a park bench. Driven by compassion, Jack offers Frank a simple sandwich, a small act of kindness that sets off a series of events that will ripple across the entire community. What begins as a quiet connection between Jack and Frank grows into something far larger. Inspired by Jack's courage, Meadow Ridge rallies to address the challenges faced by those in need. A garden blooms from an abandoned lot, a shelter opens its doors, and neighbors who were once strangers unite to rebuild after a devastating storm. But as the town transforms, not everyone is ready to embrace change. Conflicts arise as resistance brews among those who fear the growing attention on Meadow Ridge's struggles. Tensions mount as Jack faces criticism, and old friendships are tested. Yet, amidst the challenges, Jack's determination and Frank's journey toward rebuilding his life proves that hope and kindness can break even the strongest barriers. The small suburban town of Meadow Ridge was quiet that afternoon. The early autumn sun painted the streets in hues of gold and brown, the leaves crunching underfoot as 12-year-old Jack Palmer trudged home from school. His sneakers were worn at the toes, scuffed from playing soccer with his friends, but today he barely noticed the chill in the air or the slight ache in his legs. Jack's mind was elsewhere. His teacher had handed back their latest math test, and the bright red C- in the corner of the paper seemed to burn a hole in his backpack. It wasn't the grade itself that bothered him, it was the look his mom would give him when she saw it. Sarah Palmer worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment running, and Jack knew how much she hoped he would do well in school. As Jack crossed the bridge that spanned Meadow Ridge River, he slowed down. There, sitting on a wooden bench near the water, was the man he'd seen a few times before. The man looked to be in his 50s with a scruffy gray beard and a jacket that seemed 2 sizes too big for his thin frame. His belongings, a tattered blanket, a plastic grocery bag, and a bent thermos were stacked neatly at his feet. Jack hesitated, feeling a pang of curiosity mixed with nervousness. His mom had warned him not to talk to strangers, but something about the man caught his attention. He wasn't begging or bothering anyone. Instead, he sat quietly, staring at the river as if lost in thought. Jack's stomach grumbled, breaking his train of thought. He reached in his backpack and pulled out the peanut butter sandwich his mom had packed that morning. He'd been too distracted to eat it during lunch, and now he considered tossing it away. But then he thought of the man on the bench. Without fully understanding why, Jack crossed the bridge and approached him cautiously. "Hi," Jack said, his voice cracking slightly. The man looked up, startled. His blue eyes were tired but kind, and for a moment, Jack thought he might tell him to go away. "Hello," the man replied, his voice gravelly but gentle. Jack held out the sandwich, his hands trembling slightly. "Here, I thought you might be hungry." The man blinked, clearly surprised, and then a small smile spread across his face. "Thank you, kid," he said, accepting the sandwich with a nod. "What's your name?" "Jack," he said, stepping back instinctively. "What's yours?" "Frank," the man replied, unwrapping the sandwich carefully as if it were a rare gift. They stood in silence for a moment as Frank took a bite, chewing slowly. Jack felt awkward and unsure of what to say next. "You on your way home from school?" Frank asked, breaking the quiet. Jack nodded. "Yeah, my mom will probably be wondering where I am." Frank smiled again, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're a good kid, Jack. Thanks for this. It's been a while since anyone's been this kind to me." Jack wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply nodded and said, "You're welcome," before turning to leave. As he walked away, Jack felt a strange mixture of emotions: pride, curiosity, and a nagging sense of guilt that he couldn't do more. When Jack got home, their apartment smelled of spaghetti sauce and garlic. His mom stood at the stove, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She turned as he entered, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You're late," Sarah said, her voice tired but not angry. "How was school?" Jack hesitated, glancing at his backpack. "It was okay," he said, avoiding her eyes. Sarah raised an eyebrow, but didn't press him. "Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes. Go wash up. Jack nodded and headed to his small bedroom. He placed his backpack on the desk and pulled out the crumpled math test. He stared at it for a long moment, then shoved it under a stack of books. Lying on his bed, Jack thought about Frank. He wondered where the man would sleep that night and whether anyone else would stop to help him. The next day, Jack took the long way home, passing by the bench near the bridge again. To his surprise, Frank was still there, sipping from his battered thermos. "Hey, Jack," Frank said, spotting him. Jack waved awkwardly. You're still here?" Frank chuckled. "I don't have anywhere else to be," he said matter-of-factly. Jack hesitated, then sat down at the far end of the bench. "What do you do all day?" he asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Frank shrugged. "Watch the river. Think about things. It's peaceful here." Jack nodded, unsure of what else to say. After a moment, he reached into his backpack and pulled out an apple. "Do you want this?" Frank smiled, accepting it. "Thanks, kid. You're too kind." Jack stayed for a while, listening as Frank told him stories about his time in the army and the places he'd traveled. Though his words were tinged with sadness, Jack found them fascinating. When he finally left, Jack felt lighter somehow, as if sharing those moments with Frank had eased some invisible weight. That night, Jack told his mom about Frank over dinner. "Is he dangerous?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. Jack shook his head. "No, he's nice. He just doesn't have a place to live." Sarah sighed, looking troubled. "It's good to be kind, Jack, but you have to be careful. The world isn't always safe." Jack nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that Frank wasn't someone to be feared. Over the next few days, Jack made it a habit to stop by the bench on his way home. Sometimes he brought food. Other times, he simply sat and listened. One afternoon, Jack noticed Frank shivering under his thin jacket. Without thinking, Jack removed his own hoodie and handed it to him. "Here. It's not much, but it'll help," Jack said. Frank hesitated, then accepted the hoodie with a grateful smile. "You got a good heart, Jack." As Jack walked home, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. Jack didn't know it yet, but that small act of kindness was the beginning of something much bigger. The following morning dawned chilly and overcast, a stark contrast to the golden afternoons Jack had spent talking to Frank. Jack rushed out the door, his backpack slung over one shoulder, as Sarah called after him to grab a jacket. "I'll be fine, Mom," Jack shouted, already halfway down the stairs. The truth was, he didn't want to waste any time. He planned to check in on Frank before heading to school. Their conversations had become the highlight of Jack's days, and he wanted to make sure Frank was doing okay in the cooler weather. When Jack reached the bench by the bridge, Frank was there as usual, sipping from his thermos. "Morning, Jack," Frank said, his breath visible in the crisp air. He was still wearing Jack's hoodie, which looked slightly too small, but warm enough to ward off the morning chill. "Morning," Jack replied, grinning. He sat down beside Frank and pulled a granola bar from his backpack. "Here for breakfast." "You spoil me," Frank said with a chuckle, taking the granola bar. As they talked, Jack felt the minutes slipping away faster than usual. By the time he glanced at his watch, his stomach dropped. "I'm going to be late," he exclaimed, jumping up and slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Don't let me get you in trouble," Frank said, waving him off. Jack ran as fast as his legs could carry him, barely making it to his first class before the bell rang. In his hurry, he didn't realize he'd left his backpack leaning against the bench. It wasn't until lunch that Jack noticed something was wrong. He reached under his desk for his backpack, intending to grab his lunchbox, only to find an empty space where it should have been. Panic surged through him. His homework, his books, everything was in that bag. But worst of all, his math test was in there too, the one he'd promised himself he would show his mom that evening. Jack's mind raced. Had he left it at home? On the bus? Or his heart sank had he left it by the bridge? The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. Jack couldn't focus in class, replaying the morning over and over in his head. When the final bell rang, Jack sprinted to the bridge, his stomach twisting into tighter knots with every step. But when he reached the bench, his heart sank. Frank was gone, and so was the backpack. Jack sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. He didn't know what he would do. His mom would be so disappointed, and he didn't have the courage to tell her what had happened. As Jack sat there, He heard the crunch of footsteps behind him. He looked up to see Frank, carrying Jack's backpack over one shoulder. "Hey kid," Frank said, smiling gently. "You forget something?" Relief flooded through Jack so quickly that he felt tears prick the corners of his eyes. "Frank, you found it." "Didn't find it," Frank said, setting the backpack down beside Jack. "You left it here this morning. Figured you might be needing it, so I took it with me." "You brought it back?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank nodded. "I don't have much going on these days, so I thought I'd track you down. Found your school ID inside." Jack stared at Frank, overwhelmed by gratitude. "You walked all the way to my house." Frank shrugged, as if it were no big deal. Seemed like the right thing to do. When Jack arrived home that evening, his mom was waiting for him in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. "You're late again," Sarah said, glancing at him with a frown. Jack hesitated, clutching his backpack tightly. I left my bag at the bridge this morning." Sarah's frown deepened. "What were you doing at the bridge?" Jack shuffled his feet, unsure of how much to tell her. "I was talking to a friend." "A friend?" "His name is Frank," Jack blurted out. "He's the man I told you about. He brought my backpack back to me today." Sarah put down her spoon, her expression softening. "He did?" Jack nodded. "He didn't have to, but he did. He said it was the right thing to do." For a moment, Sarah said nothing, her brow furrowed in thought. Then she nodded, as if coming to a decision. "Invite him for dinner tomorrow." Jack blinked. "What?" "You've been spending time with him, and it sounds like he's been kind to you. It's only fair we return the favor." The next evening, Jack approached Frank at the bridge with more nervousness than usual. "My mom wants to invite you for dinner," Jack said quickly, before he could lose his nerve. Frank looked taken aback. "Dinner? At your place?" "Yeah," Jack said, scratching the back of his neck. "She said it's the least we can do." Frank hesitated, then gave a small smile. "Tell your mom I'd be honored." That night, their tiny apartment was filled with the warm aroma of roasted chicken and vegetables. Sarah had set the table with her best plates, and she even lit a small candle in the center. When Frank arrived, he looked nervous but clean-shaven, wearing Jack's hoodie and a pair of jeans that had clearly seen better days. "Frank," Sarah said warmly, extending her hand. "Thank you for looking out for my son." Frank shook her hand awkwardly. "He's a good kid. Makes it easy." As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed naturally. Frank shared stories about his time in the army, and Sarah asked him thoughtful questions about his life. By the end of the meal, Frank seemed more relaxed, laughing at Jack's jokes and even helping to clear the table. "You've got a good family here," Frank said as he stood to leave. "You're welcome here anytime," Sarah replied sincerely. As Frank walked back into the night, Jack watched him go, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. For the first time, he felt like he'd done something truly meaningful, not just for Frank, but for his own family too. The days following Frank's dinner at the Palmer's apartment felt different for Jack. For the first time, he noticed a sense of purpose in the small things he did. Sharing a meal, returning kindness, and simply listening seemed to have created something bigger than himself. Frank continued to sit on the bench by the bridge, and Jack still visited him after school, but now their connection felt deeper. It wasn't just about sandwiches or stories anymore. Jack started to see Frank as someone who mattered not just to him, but to the community. One afternoon, Jack's teacher, Mrs. Harper, assigned an essay titled, "If I Could Change One Thing in My Community." The idea was to think critically about a problem and propose a solution. Jack sat at his desk, chewing the end of his pencil. His classmates were whispering about potholes, stray dogs, and better parks, but Jack couldn't stop thinking about Frank. He remembered the look in Frank's eyes when he'd first handed him that sandwich hope, flickering like a weak flame. Jack wondered how many other people in Meadow Ridge felt invisible like Frank had that day. Jack began to write. The next morning, Jack handed his essay to Mrs. Harper, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't sure if it was good enough, or if it even made sense. By Friday, the essays were returned, but Mrs. Harper held on to Jack's until the end of class. "Jack," she said, motioning for him to stay as the other students filed out. He approached her desk nervously. "Yes, Mrs. Harper?" "This is extraordinary," she said, holding up his essay. "You wrote with such heart and honesty. I think it's something the town needs to hear." Jack's cheeks turned red. Really? I'm serious, she said with a kind smile. I'd like to share it with the town council. There's a meeting next week, and I think they should hear what you have to say. Jack's stomach flipped. Wait, I'd have to read it to them? It would mean a lot more coming from you, Mrs. Harper replied gently. Jack hesitated. The idea of standing in front of a room full of adults made his palms sweat. But then he thought of Frank, sitting on that cold bench every day. If there was even a small chance this could help, he had to try. I'll do it, Jack said, his voice shaking but determined. The following week, Jack stood outside the Meadow Ridge Town Hall with Sarah. He wore a button-down shirt she'd ironed for him, but he still felt underdressed and out of place. You're going to do great, Sarah said, squeezing his shoulder. Jack wasn't so sure. The room inside buzzed with conversation as residents filled the chairs. At the front, a panel of council members sat behind a long table, shuffling papers and talking quietly. When Jack's turn came, his knees felt like jelly as he walked to the podium. He glanced at his mom, who gave him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Jack began to read. He spoke about Frank, about the loneliness and hardship he saw every day on the bridge. He described how one small act of kindness had changed his view of the world, and how he believed Meadow Ridge could do more to help people like Frank, those who had slipped through the cracks but still had so much to give. When Jack finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then, a wave of applause broke out. Jack blinked in surprise, looking at the crowd. People were clapping, smiling even. One of the council members, a gray-haired man named Mr. Howard, stood up. Jack, he said, his voice steady and warm, thank you for sharing this. Your words remind us of something we often forget: compassion. We'll be discussing this further, but I want you to know how proud we are of your courage. Jack nodded, too stunned to speak. As they walked home that night, Sarah held Jack's hand. I'm so proud of you, she said softly. Jack couldn't stop smiling, though a part of him wondered what would come next. He hoped his essay hadn't been just words to those people in the room. A week later, Jack got his answer. It started with an article in the local paper. Mrs. Harper had sent the essay to the editor, and they published it under the headline, A 12-Year-Old's Vision for a Kinder Meadow Ridge. By the following weekend, people were talking about it everywhere. At the grocery store, Jack overheard a cashier telling a customer, Did you read that essay? Makes you think about what we can do, doesn't it? Jack and Sarah began to notice small changes around town. The bakery on Main Street put up a sign offering free coffee and day-old bread to anyone in need. A retired carpenter began repairing old benches and shelters at no cost. Even Frank seemed different. One day, he told Jack that a hardware store owner had offered him a part-time job. I think your essay had something to do with it, Frank said, smiling as he showed Jack the new work boots he'd been given. Jack beamed. For the first time, he realized his words had power, not just to describe problems, but to inspire change. That evening, as Jack helped Sarah wash the dishes, she said, You know, Jack, you've done something remarkable. Jack shrugged. I didn't do much. Just wrote what I felt. Sarah smiled, pulling him into a hug. And that's exactly why it mattered. The ripple effect of Jack's essay had begun, and though he couldn't see the full scope of it yet, he knew one thing. Kindness was contagious, and Meadow Ridge was starting to change. The changes around Meadow Ridge started small, like pebbles tossed into a still pond. Jack noticed the ripples everywhere on the signs, offering free meals in shop windows, in the smiles exchanged between neighbors, and in the way strangers greeted Frank as they passed the bench by the bridge. It wasn't just about Frank anymore. The essay Jack had written seemed to have sparked something larger, as if it had reminded the town of a part of itself it had forgotten. One crisp Saturday morning, Jack and Sarah were walking through the downtown area on their way to the grocery store. A group of volunteers, dressed in brightly colored vests, was painting the side of an old building that had been covered in graffiti for years. Jack paused, watching as a woman handed paint rollers to two teenagers. What's going on here? He asked. The woman turned, smiling when she saw him. Oh, you're Jack Palmer, aren't you? Jack blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, that's me. I read your essay, she said warmly. It really stuck with me. We decided it was time to start sprucing up this part of town. It's amazing how people just needed a little nudge to get involved. Jack felt his face flush. That's great, he said a bit shyly. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. See, Jack? You're inspiring people. As they continued toward the store, Jack's chest swelled with pride, but also a bit of nervousness. He hadn't expected his essay to have such an impact, and now he wondered if people expected more from him than he could give. The next day, Jack made his usual stop at the bridge to see Frank. The man looked different. His beard was neatly trimmed, and he wore a clean jacket over Jack's old hoodie. Looking sharp, Jack said with a grin. Frank chuckled. Thanks. It's part of my new job. The hardware store guy gave me some hours to help with inventory. First paycheck came in yesterday. That's awesome, Jack said, genuinely thrilled. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key on a frayed string. I also got this. Found a room to rent not far from here. It's not much, but it's mine. Jack stared at the key, feeling a mix of happiness and relief. Frank, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you. Couldn't have done it without you, kid, Frank said, his voice steady but full of emotion. Over the next few weeks, Jack watched as Meadow Ridge continued to transform. One morning at school, Mrs. Harper announced a new project, a kindness chain. Each student was given a paper link to write down an act of kindness they had performed or witnessed. The chain grew quickly, stretching along the walls of the classroom and into the hallway. Jack wrote about Frank and his job, feeling a rush of pride as he added his link to the growing display. At home, Sarah started volunteering with a local church group that was collecting supplies for families in need. Jack often joined her, helping to sort canned goods and fold donated clothes. It feels good to give back, Sarah said one evening as they packed a box of blankets. I think your essay reminded me of that. Despite the positivity spreading through the community, not everyone was happy with the changes. At a neighborhood meeting one evening, Jack overheard a group of adults complaining about the increased attention on Meadow Ridge's homeless population. This is going to bring all kinds of problems, one man said, crossing his arms. Another woman nodded. They're just going to take advantage of the free stuff. It's not like they're contributing. Jack clenched his fists, anger bubbling inside him. He wanted to say something, but the adults spoke with such authority that he felt his voice would be lost. The frustration followed him home, where he sat in his room, staring at the small wooden bridge model he had been building with Frank's help. How can people be so cruel? Jack muttered to himself. A few days later, Jack and Sarah were invited to a community event organized by the town council. The goal was to celebrate the positive changes happening in Meadow Ridge and to encourage more people to get involved. The event was held at the community center, where tables were set up with food, crafts, and information about local initiatives. Jack was helping Sarah hand out flyers for the church group when he spotted a familiar face in the crowd. It was the man who had complained at the meeting, standing next to his teenage son. Jack recognized the boy, Jason, one of his closest friends from school. Hi, Mr. Grayson, Jack said cautiously, approaching them. Mr. Grayson turned, his expression neutral but guarded. Hello, Jack. Jason avoided Jack's gaze, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. I was wondering, Jack said, his voice steady despite his nerves, if you'd like to help us with the supply drive. We're collecting food and clothes for families in need. Mr. Grayson frowned, looking as though he was about to decline. But before he could speak, Jason said, I'll help. Both Jack and Mr. Grayson stared at him in surprise. It sounds like a good cause, Jason added, his voice quiet but firm. Mr. Grayson hesitated, then sighed. All right, we'll see what we can do. That moment stuck with Jack as one of the most unexpected acts of kindness he'd ever witnessed. Jason's courage to stand up to his father sparked something in Jack, an understanding that even small choices could shift the tide. By the end of the event, Jack had spoken to dozens of people, sharing Frank's story and encouraging others to get involved. When the mayor approached him and thanked him for his efforts, Jack felt a new sense of responsibility. We're stronger together, the mayor said, echoing the words Jack's mom had told him so often. That night, Jack sat at his desk, staring at the bridge model. He picked up a marker and carefully wrote a word across one of the wooden planks. Hope. The changes in Meadow Ridge were still just beginning, but Jack knew one thing for sure. The kindness spreading through his town wasn't just a series of small acts. It was a movement. The autumn weeks in Meadow Ridge passed with a steady rhythm, punctuated by moments of unexpected kindness and growing unity. Jack began to notice how people seemed more willing to help one another, neighbors sharing tools, strangers holding open doors, and even the occasional thank you for efforts that might once have gone unnoticed. But life was not without challenges. The crisp air carried the hint of an early winter, and Jack often worried about Frank and others like him who were still finding their footing. While Frank now had a room to call his own, many in Meadow Ridge weren't as lucky. The first frost of the season came in mid-November, and with it, dark, swollen clouds rolled over the town. By late afternoon, heavy rain began to fall, turning streets into shallow rivers and drains into gushing torrents. Jack sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, finishing his homework while she prepared dinner. The hum of the heater was a comforting backdrop to the storm outside. "Weather's getting rough," Sarah remarked, glancing at the window. "I hope everyone has a safe place to stay tonight." Jack thought of Frank and the other people he'd seen around town, some huddled under bus shelters, others pushing shopping carts filled with their belongings. The image made his stomach tighten, as if reading his mind. Sarah said, "Do you think Frank's doing okay?" Jack nodded slowly. "I think so. He has that room now, but there are so many others who don't." Sarah sighed. "We can't help everyone, but we can try to make a difference where we can." Later that night, as Jack lay in bed listening to the pounding rain, a thought gnawed at the edges of his mind. What if someone out there was in trouble? What if they needed help? He tossed and turned for what felt like hours before finally drifting off, his dreams filled with images of rising water and voices calling for help. The next morning, Meadow Ridge woke to chaos. The storm had flooded several low-lying areas of town, and a few families had been forced to evacuate their homes. Jack saw the aftermath on his walk to school. Soaked belongings piled on sidewalks, streets lined with fallen branches, and clusters of people standing in front yards assessing the damage. At school, Mrs. Harper's usual cheer was replaced by a somber tone. "Some of our neighbors have been badly affected by the storm," she told the class. "If any of you want to help, the community center is organizing a drive to collect supplies for those in need." Jack's hand shot up. "What kind of supplies?" "Anything useful," Mrs. Harper said. "Blankets, food, clothing. Even small donations can make a big difference." Jack nodded, already planning to ask Sarah if they could help after school. When Jack arrived at the community center that afternoon, the place was buzzing with activity. Volunteers sorted donations into piles, while others set up cots and distributed hot meals to families who had been displaced by the flood. Jack spotted Sarah near the back, folding blankets with a group of women. She waved him over, her face flushed from the effort but lit with a determined smile. "Glad you're here," she said. "We could use another set of hands." Jack jumped in, organizing boxes of canned goods and passing out paper cups of hot chocolate. As he worked, he felt a growing sense of purpose. The air was filled with a hum of cooperation, strangers coming together in a way that felt both natural and extraordinary. As the evening wore on, Jack heard familiar voices calling his name. He turned to see Frank and Mr. Grayson entering the shelter, each carrying a load of donated supplies. "Frank, Mr. Grayson," Jack exclaimed, rushing over. "Figured we could lend a hand," Frank said, setting down a bag of blankets. Mr. Grayson gave a curt nod. "Jason insisted we help. Thought it was the right thing to do." Jack grinned, glancing at Jason, who was trailing behind his father. "Thanks for coming." Jason shrugged but smiled faintly. "It's no big deal." The four of them spent the next few hours working side by side, sorting donations and helping set up cots. Jack couldn't help but notice the change in Mr. Grayson's demeanor. He seemed quieter, less combative, as if the act of helping had softened something inside him. By the time they finished, it was late and the shelter was quieting down. Families were settling onto their cots, some reading to their children while others huddled under donated blankets. Jack and Frank sat on a bench near the door, watching the scene unfold. "You've got a good thing going here," Frank said, his voice low but warm. Jack shrugged. "It's not just me. Everyone's helping." "Yeah," Frank said with a nod. "But sometimes it just takes one person to get the ball rolling." Jack looked around the shelter, taking in the faces of people who, despite their circumstances, seemed comforted by the sense of community. He thought about what Frank had said and realized it was true. As they walked home, Sarah put an arm around Jack's shoulders. "You're doing something special, Jack," she said softly. "You've got a way of bringing people together." Jack smiled but didn't respond. The truth was he didn't feel like a leader or a hero. He just saw things that needed fixing and tried to help. That night, as the rain began to fall again, Jack lay awake, thinking about the storm and its aftermath. He realized that Meadow Ridge had faced its share of struggles, but the way the town had rallied together gave him hope. For the first time, Jack felt like the ripples he had started might become waves, spreading farther than he could imagine. The storm's aftermath left Meadow Ridge with more than just soaked carpets and fallen branches. It left a challenge. While the community center had been a beacon of hope for many displaced families, there were murmurs of dissatisfaction brewing beneath the surface. Not everyone in Meadow Ridge appreciated the changes happening around town. Some saw the newfound focus on helping the homeless and needy as a disruption to the quiet life they'd worked hard to maintain. Jack had heard it in passing comments from neighbors, conversations at the grocery store, and even grumbles during church services. But Jack also saw something different. People like Frank were beginning to find their footing, and acts of kindness were becoming more commonplace. To Jack, it felt like the town was finally starting to live up to its potential. One Friday afternoon, Jack stayed after school to help Mrs. Harper hang posters for an upcoming community meeting. The event was titled Rebuilding Together, Meadow Ridge's Next Steps, and it was meant to address ongoing needs after the storm. "You've done a lot for this town, Jack," Mrs. Harper said as she stapled a poster to the bulletin board. Jack blushed, shrugging. "I just wrote an essay. Everyone else did the real work." "Don't sell yourself short," she replied, smiling warmly. "Your words inspired people. That's no small thing." Jack nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that some people didn't see it that way. On his way home, Jack decided to stop by the bridge. Frank was sitting on the bench, as usual, but he looked troubled. "Hey, Frank," Jack said, sitting down beside him. "Everything okay?" Frank sighed, rubbing his hands together against the chill. "I'm fine, kid. Just thinking about how things have changed around here. It's mostly good, but not everyone's happy about it." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" "There are some folks who think helping people like me is a waste of time," Frank said, his voice low. "They don't see us as worth the effort." Jack's chest tightened. He'd heard whispers of this before, but hearing it from Frank made it feel more real. "That's not true," Jack said firmly. "You're worth it. Everyone is." Frank gave him a small smile. "Thanks, Jack. But not everyone sees it that way." The community meeting was held the following week at the town hall. Jack arrived early with Sarah, carrying a stack of flyers about the supply drive still underway. The room was packed so much so that Jack had to squeeze through the crowd to find a seat. The mayor opened the meeting with a speech about the importance of working together to rebuild Meadow Ridge. Jack felt a swell of pride as the mayor mentioned the essay that had sparked the town's movement toward kindness. But as the floor opened for public discussion, the tone of the meeting shifted. "I think we've done enough for the homeless," one man said, standing up with a scowl. "We got our own families to worry about." Another woman chimed in. "These shelters and handouts are attracting people who don't belong here. It's not good for the town." Jack clenched his fists under the table, his heart pounding. He wanted to speak up, but the adults were loud and confident, their words cutting through the room like knives. Finally, the mayor raised his hand for silence. "Let's remember why we're here," he said firmly. "This is about coming together, not dividing ourselves further." But the tension in the room was palpable. As they walked home that evening, Sarah could see the frustration etched on Jack's face. "You're upset," she said gently. Jack nodded, kicking a pebble down the sidewalk. "How can people be so selfish? Don't they see how much good we've done?" "Change is hard for some people," Sarah said. "It makes them feel vulnerable, like they're losing control. But that doesn't mean we stop trying." Jack thought about her words as they passed the bridge. Frank wasn't there, and Jack wondered if he'd heard about the meeting. The next day at school, Jack was sitting in the cafeteria when Jason slid into the seat across from him. "Hey," Jason said, his voice low. "Hey," Jack replied, surprised. They hadn't talked much since Jason's dad had reluctantly joined the supply drive. "My dad was at that meeting last night," Jason said, not meeting Jack's eyes. Jack's stomach sank. "Yeah, I saw him." Jason hesitated, then added, "He said some stuff at home about how you're just a kid and don't understand how the world works." Jack felt a flash of anger, but swallowed it down. "What do you think?" Jason looked up, his face conflicted. "I think you're doing the right thing. Even if my dad doesn't see it, I do." Jack stared at Jason, taken aback. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. "Thanks," Jack said finally. "That means a lot." Jason nodded, then stood up. "If you ever need help with anything, let me know." That small moment stayed with Jack. It reminded him that even when people resisted change, there were others willing to step up. A few days later, Jack was back at the community center, helping Sarah sort through donations. He was stacking cans of soup when he overheard a conversation near the entrance. "You've been coming here a lot lately," a familiar voice said. Jack turned to see Frank talking to Mr. Grayson, who was holding a box of donated coats. "Figured I'd pitch in," Mr. Grayson replied, his tone gruff but not unkind. "Glad to see it," Frank said, extending a hand. After a moment of hesitation, Mr. Grayson shook it. Jack watched the exchange, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. If someone like Mr. Grayson could come around, maybe others could too. That night, Jack sat at his desk, working on the wooden bridge model he and Frank had started weeks ago. He carefully painted the final plank, his brush steady despite the weight of his thoughts. The meeting had been tough, but moments like the one between Frank and Mr. Grayson reminded Jack that change wasn't always easy or immediate. It was like building a bridge. Each piece took time and effort, but with enough patience and care, it could connect people in ways they never expected. The following Saturday, Meadow Ridge woke to a rare clear sky. The chill of early winter had settled over the town, and frost glittered on car windows and rooftops. Despite the cold, Jack was up early, bundled in a scarf and jacket as he joined Sarah at the community center. Frank had invited Jack to join him for a special project that morning, one he hadn't explained in much detail. Jack was curious, but didn't press for answers. As they waited, Jack noticed a group of volunteers unloading supplies from trucks, stacking them neatly near the center's entrance. The buzz of activity had become a familiar sight in Meadow Ridge lately, but Jack still marveled at how the town had rallied together. "Ready to go, kid?" Frank's voice called from behind. Jack turned to see Frank approaching, holding a pair of work gloves and a toolbox. His new jacket, though still modest, looked warm and well-fitted. "Where are we going?" Jack asked, falling in a step beside him. "You'll see," Frank said with a knowing smile. They walked for about 10 minutes before reaching an old, overgrown lot on the edge of downtown. Jack recognized it immediately. The lot had been abandoned for years, a patch of weeds and broken concrete that most people avoided. To Jack's surprise, several people were already there, bundled in coats and gloves as they pulled weeds, cleared trash, and hauled debris into dumpsters. "What's all this?" Jack asked, his breath visible in the cold air. Frank grinned. "This is the start of something new. The town council approved a plan to turn this lot into a community garden and shelter. Figured we'd pitch in." Jack's heart swelled as he took in the scene. People of all ages were working side by side, their laughter and conversation cutting through the crisp morning air. "Let's get to it," Frank said, handing Jack a pair of gloves. For hours, Jack worked alongside Frank and the other volunteers, pulling up stubborn weeds, raking leaves, and clearing piles of old bricks. Despite the hard labor, there was a sense of joy in the air. Halfway through the day, Mr. Grayson arrived with Jason and a few other neighbors. Jack watched as Mr. Grayson joined a group of men, lifting a rusted metal frame into a truck. Jason waved at Jack from across the lot, then jogged over. "This is pretty cool, huh?" "Yeah," Jack said, smiling. "I didn't think so many people would show up." Jason shrugged. "Guess everyone likes the idea of making this place better. My dad even said it's not such a bad idea anymore." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Your dad said that?" Jason smirked. "Don't let it go to your head." As the sun climbed higher, Sarah arrived with a thermos of hot chocolate and a tray of sandwiches, which she handed out to the volunteers. Jack couldn't help but notice how at ease she looked, chatting with neighbors and laughing with Frank as they sipped from steaming cups. At one point, the mayor stopped by to thank the volunteers. He shook hands with Frank and Sarah, then crouched down to talk to Jack. "You've been busy," the mayor said with a smile. "I hear you've had a hand in a lot of the changes around here." Jack felt his cheeks flush. "I just wanted to help." "Well, you've done more than that," the mayor replied. "This garden is just the beginning. It's going to be a place where people come together, not just for food, but for support." Jack nodded, a sense of pride blooming in his chest. By late afternoon, most of the debris had been cleared, and the lot looked more like a blank canvas than an abandoned space. Frank and Jack stood near the center, surveying their work. "You've got a good eye for these things," Frank said, clapping Jack on the shoulder. Jack grinned. "I guess it just feels good to see things get better." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "You know, this garden, it's not just about the plants or the shelter. It's about giving people a chance to feel like they're part of something, like they belong." Jack looked up at Frank, realizing how much the man had changed since they'd first met. The Frank he knew now carried himself with quiet confidence, a far cry from the weary figure he'd seen sitting on the bench weeks ago. "You've come a long way, too," Jack said. Frank smiled. "Guess we're all building something, kid, bit by bit." That evening, as Jack walked home with Sarah, he felt the familiar ache of tired muscles, but it was accompanied by a deep sense of fulfillment. "You're quiet," Sarah said, glancing at him. Jack shrugged. "Just thinking about how much has changed." Sarah smiled softly. "It's because of people like you, Jack. People who aren't afraid to make a difference." Jack looked down at the sidewalk, his thoughts drifting to the empty lot. He couldn't wait to see it finished, to watch the garden grow and the shelter fill with life. But more than that, he realized he couldn't wait to see what other changes Meadow Ridge would bring. The transformation of the empty lot into a community garden and shelter continued over the following weeks, with volunteers braving the crisp November air to work together. Jack had never seen Meadow Ridge so alive with energy. Every day, new faces joined the effort, some offering supplies, others lending their hands. On one such day, Jack arrived after school to find Frank standing near the freshly dug garden beds. He was talking to a woman Jack didn't recognize, a middle-aged lady with kind eyes and a notebook in hand. "Jack!" Frank called, waving him over. The woman turned, smiling warmly. "You must be the famous Jack Palmer." Jack shuffled his feet, glancing at Frank, who chuckled. "This is Mrs. Barrett," Frank explained. "She's writing an article about the garden for the Meadow Ridge Gazette." "Oh," Jack said, surprised. "I've been hearing a lot about you," Mrs. Barrett said, jotting something in her notebook. "Your essay inspired so many people, and now this garden is coming to life. Do you have a minute to share your thoughts?" Jack hesitated, still unused to the attention. But Frank gave him an encouraging nod, so he took a deep breath and said, "I guess I just wanted to help. When I met Frank, I realized there were people in our town who needed more support. I never thought it would grow into something this big." Mrs. Barrett smiled. "That's a beautiful sentiment, Jack. I think it's important for people to see how one act of kindness can lead to so much change." Jack nodded, feeling a mix of pride and bashfulness as she scribbled in her notebook. That evening, Jack and Sarah were eating dinner when the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," Sarah said, rising from her chair. Moments later, she returned with an envelope in her hand. "This came for you," she said, placing it in front of Jack. Jack frowned, looking at the neat handwriting on the envelope. His name was written in bold letters, but there was no return address. Curious, he opened it and unfolded a handwritten letter. "Dear Jack, I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for Meadow Ridge. My family was one of the ones displaced by the storm, and the shelter your community created gave us a place to stay when we had nowhere else to go. Your courage and kindness remind me that even in difficult times, there is always hope. You've inspired me to believe in the goodness of people again. With gratitude, Emily Daniels." Jack stared at the letter, his chest tightening. He didn't know Emily Daniels, but her words filled him with a sense of accomplishment he couldn't quite describe. "Who is it from?" Sarah asked gently. Jack handed her the letter, watching as she read it. When she looked up, her eyes were shimmering. "This is why we do what we do," Sarah said softly. Jack nodded, folding the letter carefully and tucking it into his backpack. The next day, Jack shared the letter with Frank while they worked on painting the garden's wooden fence. "Sounds like you've made a real difference," Frank said, his voice filled with admiration. It's not just me, Jack said, dipping his brush into the paint. It's everyone. The whole town. Frank smiled, shaking his head. You're too humble, kid. You got this ball rolling. Don't forget that. Later that week, Meadow Ridge held a fundraising soccer game to gather support for the shelter. Jack, Jason, and a group of other kids from school played on one team, while their parents and teachers made up the opposing side. The game drew a large crowd. People lined the edges of the field, cheering and waving homemade signs. Food trucks donated a portion of their sales to the cause, and local businesses offered raffle prizes to raise additional funds. As Jack raced across the field, kicking the ball toward the goal, he felt a surge of joy that had nothing to do with winning. It was the sight of the community coming together, united by a shared purpose, that made his heart swell. After the game, Jack stood near the field, sipping a cup of hot cider. Frank approached, clapping him on the back. You did good out there, Frank said, grinning. Jack shrugged. I think my team let me score on purpose. Frank laughed. Maybe, but it was still a good show. As they watched the crowd mingle and chat, Frank's expression grew thoughtful. You know, he said, it's funny how life works. A few weeks ago, I was sitting on a bench, wondering if anyone even noticed me. Now here I am, part of something bigger than I ever imagined. Jack looked up at Frank, feeling a swell of pride for his friend. You're not invisible anymore, Frank. You never were. People just needed to see you. Frank nodded, his eyes misty. Thanks to you, Jack. That night, as Jack walked home with Sarah, he couldn't stop smiling. The letter from Emily Daniels, the soccer game, and the growing sense of community all filled him with a quiet sense of purpose. When they reached the apartment, Jack pulled the letter from his backpack and placed it on his desk. He looked at it for a long moment, then picked up a pen and began writing his own note. Dear Emily, thank you for your kind words. They mean a lot to me. I'm so glad the shelter helped your family, and I hope things are getting better for you. Sometimes, it feels like there's so much to fix in the world, and it's hard to know where to start. But your letter reminded me that even small acts of kindness can make a big difference. Sincerely, Jack Palmer. Jack smiled as he folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. He didn't have Emily's address, but he decided to leave it at the community center. Maybe it would find its way to her. As he got ready for bed, Jack felt lighter, as if the weight of the world had shifted slightly. He wasn't just helping others. They were helping him too, reminding him of the power of hope and connection. A week after the soccer game, Jack was back at the community garden, watching as volunteers planted the first rows of winter vegetables. The once empty lot was now vibrant with life garden beds neatly arranged in rows, a wooden fence freshly painted, and a small structure nearing completion at the far end. The structure would soon serve as a temporary shelter for those in need, and Jack couldn't help but feel a swell of pride every time he saw it. Frank had been busy too. His part-time job at the hardware store had grown into something more permanent, and he'd recently signed the lease on a small apartment near the garden. Got a surprise for you, Frank said one afternoon, beckoning Jack to follow him. Jack trailed behind as Frank led him to a modest brick building just a few blocks away. The building looked old but sturdy, its windows lined with cheerful flower boxes. This is me, Frank said, fishing a key from his pocket. He unlocked the door and gestured for Jack to step inside. The apartment was small, a single room with a kitchenette, a worn couch, and a bed neatly made in the corner. But it was clean and filled with little touches that made it feel like home. A photo of Frank's army unit on the wall, a potted plant on the windowsill, and a stack of books on the nightstand. Wow, Jack said, looking around. It's awesome. Frank chuckled. It's not much, but it's mine, and I wouldn't have it without you. Jack shook his head. You did this, Frank. You worked hard and made it happen. Maybe, Frank said, sitting down on the couch. But you gave me the push I needed. You reminded me that people care. Jack felt a lump in his throat as he looked around the apartment. Seeing Frank here, in his own space, was a reminder of how far they'd both come since that first day by the bridge. Can I help with anything? Jack asked, eager to contribute. Actually, Frank said with a grin, I got something for you. He reached into a box by the couch and pulled out a small wooden bridge model. It was the one they had started together weeks ago, now complete and painted with care. I figured it was time to finish this, Frank said, handing it to Jack. Jack took the bridge, running his fingers over the smooth wood. Across one of the planks, Frank had painted a single word in bold letters. Hope. Thank you, Jack said softly, his voice thick with emotion. No, Frank replied, smiling. Thank you. Later that evening, Jack returned home, the wooden bridge cradled in his arms. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared dinner. What's that? She asked, glancing over her shoulder. Jack set the bridge on the table, grinning. It's from Frank. He finished it for me. Sarah came over, inspecting the bridge with a smile. It's beautiful, just like everything you've helped build in this town. Jack blushed, ducking his head. It's not just me. Everyone's been helping. Maybe, Sarah said, brushing a hand through his hair. But you were the spark that started it all. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The garden was officially open to the public, and families from all over Meadow Ridge came to admire the rows of kale, spinach, and carrots growing in the frosty soil. The shelter at the back of the lot was also nearly complete, its doors set to open in time for winter. Jack spent every spare moment at the garden, helping wherever he could. One afternoon, as he was stacking chairs inside the shelter, he noticed a woman standing near the entrance. She was holding a baby in her arms, her coat threadbare and her face lined with exhaustion. Can I help you? Jack asked, approaching her. The woman hesitated, then nodded. I heard this place was opening soon. I'm looking for somewhere to stay. Jack's heart ached as he looked at her, thinking of the letter he'd received from Emily Daniels. He knew there were so many more families like hers, people who needed help, who just needed someone to see them. Let me get someone for you, Jack said, hurrying to find Sarah. That evening, as Jack and Sarah walked home, he couldn't stop thinking about the woman and her baby. Do you think they'll be okay? Jack asked. Sarah nodded. The shelter will make sure they're taken care of. It's why we build it, to give people a safe place to start over. Jack was quiet for a moment, then said, I wish we could do more. You've already done so much, Sarah replied gently. And the work doesn't end here. There will always be more to do, but we're not alone. This community has proven that we're stronger together. Jack nodded, feeling a quiet determination settle in his chest. He thought of Frank, the garden, the shelter, and the people who had come together to create something better for Meadow Ridge. The work wasn't finished, not by a long shot. But as Jack looked up at the stars twinkling above the town, he felt certain that they were heading in the right direction. Winter arrived in Meadow Ridge quietly, dusting the rooftops and tree branches with a light layer of snow. The garden beds, now dormant under protective coverings, stood as a promise of what was to come in spring. Meanwhile, the shelter behind the garden had officially opened its doors, offering warmth and safety to those who needed it most. Jack stood outside the shelter one morning, watching as a group of volunteers unloaded donations from a truck. Among them was Frank, his breath visible in the frosty air as he carried boxes of blankets inside. Morning, Jack, Frank called, grinning. Morning, Jack replied, shoving his hands deeper into his coat pockets. Frank approached, dusting snow from his jacket. Looks like things are really coming together, huh? Jack nodded, looking at the bustling activity around them. Yeah, it's amazing to see how much everyone cares now. Frank smiled. That's the thing about kindness. Once people see how much of a difference it makes, they can't help but pass it on. Later that afternoon, Jack decided to visit the community center. Inside, he found Sarah helping sort donations with a group of neighbors. One of them was Mr. Grayson, who was carefully folding clothes into neat piles. Hey, Jack, Jason said, appearing at his side. Hey, Jack replied, surprised to see his friend there again. You've been helping out a lot lately. Jason shrugged, a shy smile on his face. It feels good. Plus, my dad says it's important to give back. Jack glanced over at Mr. Grayson, who caught his eye and gave a small nod. Jack smiled, feeling a flicker of warmth. It hadn't been easy to win over people like Mr. Grayson, but seeing him here now felt like a small victory. That evening, as Jack and Sarah walked home, the glow of the streetlights illuminated their path. The town felt different than it had just a few months ago, warmer, despite the cold. You know, Sarah said, her voice thoughtful, I think this town has changed for the better, and a lot of that is because of you. Jack shook his head. It's not just me, Mom. It's everyone. Maybe, Sarah replied, smiling. But someone had to start it. You showed people what kindness could do. The next day, Jack visited the shelter again, this time to deliver a small box of toys and books he had collected from his classmates. Inside, he found the woman with the baby he had met earlier. She was sitting by the window, feeding her child, her face soft with relief. "Hi," Jack said, approaching her cautiously. "How are you doing?" The woman looked up, smiling. "Better, thanks to this place, and to people like you." Jack blushed, setting the box of toys on a nearby table. "I just wanted to help." "You've done more than that," she said. "You've given people like me a second chance." As Jack watched her settle back into her chair, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the shelter, but for the community that had made it possible. A few weeks later, the mayor held a ceremony at the garden to celebrate the progress Meadow Ridge had made. Families gathered around the shelter, children played in the snow-covered garden paths, and volunteers shared stories of the lives they had touched. When the mayor stepped onto the small stage to speak, he called Jack forward. "Jack Palmer," the mayor said, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "This town owes you a great deal. Your courage and compassion have inspired all of us to be better. And today, we want to honor you for everything you've done." Jack blinked, caught off guard. The crowd began to applaud, their cheers filling the air. The mayor handed Jack a small plaque engraved with his name and the words, "For inspiring a community to believe in kindness." Jack looked out at the crowd, spotting Frank, Sarah, Jason, and so many others who had been part of the journey. His heart swelled with emotion. "I'm not good at speeches," Jack began, his voice trembling slightly. "But I just want to say thank you. Not just for this, but for everything you've done to make Meadow Ridge better. This isn't about me, it's about all of us." The crowd erupted into cheers once more, and Jack felt a wave of pride and humility wash over him. That evening, Jack sat at his desk, staring at the wooden bridge Frank had given him. The word hope painted across its planks seemed to shine in the soft glow of his desk lamp. He thought about everything that had happened in the essay, the garden, the shelter, and the countless small acts of kindness that had rippled through the town. It had started with one decision, one moment of bravery, and it had grown into something bigger than he had ever imagined. Jack picked up a marker and carefully wrote a new word beneath hope: unity. As he placed the bridge back on the shelf, Jack smiled. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew Meadow Ridge was stronger now. And that was a legacy worth building on. Months later, as spring began to bloom, the community garden was thriving. Families gathered to plant vegetables, children played along the garden paths, and the shelter continued to provide a safe haven for those in need. Jack often visited the garden after school, sitting on a bench near the rows of flowers. Sometimes Frank joined him, sharing stories or simply enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. And every now and then, Jack would look around and feel a quiet satisfaction, knowing that one small act of kindness had made all the difference. Thank you for joining Jack's inspiring journey in Ripples of Kindness. If you enjoyed this story about courage, compassion, and the power of community, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every act of kindness starts with a small decision, and every subscriber helps us share these uplifting stories with more people around the world. Together, we can keep spreading hope, one story at a time. Click that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story that will warm your heart and inspire your soul.